Good morning, everyone. First of all, thank you to the Financial Services Council and Workplace Savings for the invite to speak today. As most of you know by now, I do like a platform. I also wanted to say well done to the Financial Services Council and all its members for the code, which was launched last night. Not before time, perhaps, but I think a really important step forward in terms of the industry recognising that it's for the industry to put its best foot forward with consumers, and it shouldn't be for the regulators to have to do that for them. So well done. So I know the theme is shaping the future. I thought I would start, however, by looking back a little bit, looking back to the global financial crisis. One of the features of that period that was very marked was the lack of trust, both in and within the big financial services players. And there's been a massive regulatory and political response to the damage that was caused to the global economy and to trust in financial services from the regulators and from the politicians. And that response and the focus of that response on financial stability may have masked some of the broader issues around conduct within financial services and how financial services treats the people who have to use it. So as you all know, right now, in a very visible and painful way, the failure of management and boards of financial services firms to really understand how you get your employees and your products to really generate fair outcomes for consumers, that is costing those boards and the management and the shareholders of those institutions dear at the moment. And as we've heard already across the Tasman, the issues and behaviour from financial services that's been highlighted at the Australian Royal Commission has been truly extraordinary. The importance of good conduct and good behaviour out of what we're hearing in Australia, I don't think could be any clearer. So yes, where we sit today is even more focused into that space than where we would have been 12 and 24 months ago. And there was plenty of reason even then for us to be focusing on these topics. You also heard that there are some broader themes at play as you look at conduct, which go to community expectations of financial services providers, the so-called social license to operate, and whether the financial services industry has a broader obligation to society and the communities they serve because of the place that they hold in the economy. So like everybody else, we at the FMA are still processing what is happening in Australia. We're still waiting, obviously, for the initial report from the Royal Commission, and we're looking at how those goings on, what the Commission is looking at, will be relevant to New Zealand. We are determined to play our part, ensuring that this is treated as an opportunity for you, the industry, and an opportunity for us, the regulators, to ask some hard questions about how the industry behaves, about how we regulate it, about what we're all here for. We hope that at the end of that process, a truly customer-centric industry will be in place, or at least working towards being in place, because we know that doesn't happen overnight. So you could say, if you look back to the GFC, that what we're in now is the second phase of the financial crisis, and certainly a crisis in trust from the consuming public. So earlier this year, I was at a conference in Australia, and an outfit called Edelman produced the 2018 version of their Trust Barometer. Now, unfortunately, that, although it covers a large number of jurisdictions globally, doesn't actually cover New Zealand. So we'll try and see if we can't persuade them to add New Zealand in the future. But going forward, a lot of very obvious themes that play into New Zealand. So as a general proposition, they find there's an increasing sense within the broader population that the top slice of society, in terms of wealth, have access to information and opportunity that the rest of us don't. They also found there's an increasing distrust of sizable major institutions, whether that's public or private, and far more influence in decision-making from peer-to-peer mechanisms. So if you look at the hotel industry, you'd look at what Airbnb's done, what TripAdvisor, Trivago, all of those outfits have done to kind of disintermediate the customer from the big end of town, if you like. So the 2018 report also showed that the slow recovery in trust in financial services as a specific sector that had been occurring in those reports since about 2012 has stalled. That in most of the major jurisdictions it's gone backwards, and in jurisdictions like the States it's down as much as 20% from where it was last year. And that report reflected that whilst most consumers trust their financial services providers to do the basics, the transactional stuff if you like, to complete transactions and look after their money, they don't trust their financial services providers to do the right thing and look after their interests. So trust is clearly on the decline again, and it's a currency that, at least in some quarters, does seem to have lost its value. So how did we get here? Well, I think there's a whole bunch of factors. One of them to me is that I think if you look at the financial service supermarkets that some of the banking and insurance groups have become, you could make the argument that within those firms, they're spread too thin across product lines. The synergies and cross-selling that those groups thought was going to occur by bolting lots of very different sectors of financial services together didn't happen naturally, and forcing them to happen has led to some really bad outcomes for consumers. I think I'd also point to shareholder expectations, which emphasize short-term earnings over long-term value. I think that's driven, or at least encouraged, boards and managements to operate beyond the bounds of what is decent and what is right. I think the focus on serving shareholders above all else in much of current Western corporate law might be argued to be the heart of this issue for financial services. But for sure, you may debate whether the current model for financial services is too heavily focused on returns for shareholders or returns for management. It certainly doesn't look like it's too heavily focused on returns for customers. So I noted that last week Wayne Byers at APRA, the Australian Prudential Regulator, has been commenting much along these lines, specifically in this case about the banks. APRA are looking for much clearer lines of management responsibility and accountability, and making sure that consequences are felt for those running financial services firms when there are failures in their areas of responsibility. He also specifically commented to my last point that he sees much too much emphasis on, at the board level in financial services, on shareholder returns. Now, I do acknowledge that's a hard criticism to levy against shareholders, but it definitely seems to me a feature of the environment. So how do we change? How do we change this? What can we do? Well, I guess I would start, notwithstanding the kind words of the Minister, that some of this can be achieved by regulation and by regulators, but actually not much. The FMC Act, for instance, doesn't really talk in great detail about fair treatment or community expectations, and you wouldn't expect it to as a piece of legislation. It does set out a bunch of things that issuers of financial products and securities should do, and that the sellers of those financial products ought to do. But I do think, and I've said before, that financial services is different, it's special, it poses some particular challenges in the interaction between customers and the providers. The information asymmetry between providers and customers, the difficulty in knowing at the point of sale whether that product is suitable or whether that was a good sale, whether it will generate a good outcome, the fact that harm caused by poor product design or inappropriate sales or advice often only manifest years later, if at all. And some of the decisions that are required by customers in the financial services can be life-changing, and providers need to respect that. So the FMA has pushed licensed firms, and indeed all firms operating in financial services, to ask themselves the hard questions. Not just, do we comply with the law, but is this the right thing for us to be doing? Our conduct guide in early 2017 was resisted in some places because people felt it was seeking to extend the law past what the actual legislation has, or to place demands on financial services firms that are unreasonable or overly prescriptive. Well, I would say to you as an audience, if you want the sector to be trusted, asking what's right rather than whether it's specifically against the law, that is exactly what is required. So thinking a little bit for a conference such as this about how financial services firms can differentiate themselves in the conduct space, I think it is absolutely possible. The Edelman report, for instance, across global financial services talked about a bunch of pluses and minuses in terms of what they find is driving consumer trust. So on the plus side, I'll pick the top three, no real surprises here. Easily understood terms and conditions, reliable fraud and security protection, and easily accessible information on products and services. So that's about communication. On the negative side, not surprisingly, you're going to see the flip side of some of those. So the top three would be poor product or cost transparency, confusing description of products and services, and unwanted selling pressure. I can't help but comment that charging people, alive or dead, for services they never received or even aware they were available to them probably ought to take a place on the list of negatives. So against that backdrop, one of the challenges here is how to engineer or re-engineer complicated financial services firms and groups so that the voice of the customer is being properly heard. And where the customer has no voice because they themselves don't know what a good outcome ought to look like, that someone else is looking out for them. So I think for boards of financial services firms, you need to change your view as to how much money senior management should be making. You need to change your view on how much money shareholders can expect to make. And you need to focus unrelentingly on your customers. And in this context, the customer is, of course, the end user of the product, not the intermediary who is selling it for you. I think for boards and managements more generally, I can't stress enough, given the events of the last 9-10 months in Australia, that this can't be changed by tinkering at the edges. The change has to be much more fundamental. The Sedgwick report in Australia actually did a pretty good job of calling out the conflicts and the poorly aligned incentives and motivations caused by paying for sales. Unfortunately, that report didn't foresee the drama of the Royal Commission and the tipping point that I think that public exercise is creating in terms of public trust in major financial services providers. So the recommendations about balanced scorecards and the like, which still remain elements of sales volumes, they just didn't go far enough. It will hurt sales, yeah, for sure, and it will hurt shareholder returns in the short term. But we are finally seeing firms begin to move away from paying their staff for sales. We are finally seeing firms question their use of soft commissions as a way to incentivize advisors to put customers into their products. Many of you will have heard me say it before, and we are clear on it in our conduct guide. There is no point pontificating at the top about treating customers well unless you're prepared to build the systems, the controls, and the culture that does it for you. Even the best management team has little chance of being everywhere at the same time and in every decision. As the moral academics will tell you, it's the instinctive decisions your staff make when nobody is watching that defines a firm's moral stance and its moral sense. It's why in our work with the Reserve Bank on the Conduct and Culture Review, we have spent less time trying to unearth isolated but dramatic failings to publicly humiliate banks and insurers with. And we've spent more time focusing on whether the fair treatment of customers is actually embedded in how those firms are set up. What are the criteria for paying or promoting people? What are the fundamental design principles that you use in your product development? How are complaints handled? What do you do even though the facts might indicate there's been no breach of the law or no breach of the rules, when nonetheless there is a disappointed or a confused customer? How did you build your processes or training so that customers understand the limitations of the product being sold to them or the risks inherent in the investment you recommended to them? What's in place, for example, to make sure customers understand that the employee in question is only advising them on the products of their employer, not the entire street? Are the sales staff trained to listen for the question that isn't actually asked, the question that probably should have been asked, the question that will betray that that customer needs more help in making a good decision? So in the Conduct and Culture Review, we in the Reserve Bank are making our assessments across 4 broad themes: governance, conduct risk management, customer focus, and remediation. So that's designed to get under the skin of how those organizations and those sectors are operating. Not only looking at intent, but looking at how it's actually working in practice. Now, this may just possibly be all quite dull to most of you in the room, and that's because you know it already. You actually really don't need me up here banging on to know the truth of a lot of what I'm saying. I think the risk is, though, that the public don't believe you know it, or that if you do, that you're really going to change. I can see how hard many of the firms that we deal with are trying to shift the way you operate to focus more on customers and to build trust. But I'm really not sure that the public see it. The issues in the Royal Commission and their reporting here have almost certainly set this back a bit, even in New Zealand. But in any event, even without the Royal Commission, my view is that the change was moving at a slower pace than it should have done. In terms of an understanding as to how to build the right structures and processes, we see variances across the firms in each sector and even within firms. Some of the firms that do strike us as having a genuinely customer-focused culture have that in some parts, but they don't have it in others. And even those that do have it across the piece aren't always creating and embedding the repeatable processes and requirements internally to ensure that it happens every time. You can't will good conduct on a financial services firm above a certain size. You actually have to wire it in. As I say, that sounds a little bit dull, and it is, but it's what needs to happen. And things won't be as good as they need to be for customers and investors, for them genuinely to believe they'll get a fair deal, for them to participate happily in financial services. One last point before I wrap up. I should also add that we at the FMA are conscious that for any regulatory system to work, there needs to be trust in the regulator. So that's trust that the regulator will behave fairly and proportionately, and trust that they will be effective. It's why one of our strategic priorities in our strategic risk outlook and our annual corporate plan is our own efficiency and effectiveness. We need to spend the money that we gather in levies and fees and that we receive from the taxpayer to do the best job possible of regulating the pieces of financial services that we license and that we oversee. We are still learning on the job, and we appreciate that in many places the industry is too. We have, however, signalled that whilst we're proud of the efforts we've made to engage with and set out our expectations for the industry, we are also frustrated in places at the pace of change. That frustration will manifest itself over time as we become less understanding and less tolerant of firms that talk a good game but don't put the hard yards in to make sure it happens. So I'll wrap up so we can move to the panel by saying that these days, hopefully I'm right in suspecting that the real crooks don't go into regulated financial services. There are too many rules and too much risk of getting caught. We find they tend to set up on the edges and try and operate out of the side of the referees. But what does seem to happen in financial services is an insidious slide into, it feels a bit tacky, but everyone else is doing it and we can't afford to be left behind. We can't afford to be the people that change it first. Changing profitable practices and behaviours that seemed fine only a few years ago because the expectations of customers and regulators have changed seems hard. So my message to you would be, have some faith in the long-term power of trust and the differentiator that trust and fairness will be. Thank you.